24 right, stay going, contact turn 7767, park parallel. 24 left, and echo 7, clear to take off. That's a 3944 LA.
It was 7:30 on the evening of November 5th, 1997, when the crew of a Virgin Atlantic Airbus A340 reported for duty at Los Angeles International Airport. Around the same time, 98 passengers were arriving at the airport and checking in their bags for the long journey to London Heathrow. The aircraft they were flying on was a 4-year-old Airbus A340-300. The A340 was a modern aircraft with an excellent safety record. Operating as Flight 24, this aircraft would fly through the night, across the North American continent, and out over the Atlantic Ocean before touching down in the UK the next afternoon. The flight was scheduled to take about 10.5 hours. Up in the cockpit of the 4-engined aircraft were 3 flight crew members. Sitting in the left-hand seat was 40-year-old Captain Tim Barnby. Barnby was an experienced pilot with more than 14,000 flying hours, just short of 3,000 of which were on the Airbus A340. As it would turn out, he would need to draw on every one of these hours as the flight neared Heathrow. Joining him in the cockpit was 32-year-old First Officer Andrew Morley. Morley was new to the A340, with just 301 hours on the jet. However, he had over 4,500 hours on the Airbus A320 and Fokker 100, meaning he was by no means an inexperienced pilot. Sitting behind the 2 operating pilots was a relief pilot, 28-year-old First Officer Craig Matheson. Matheson would take over from each of the pilots in turn during a portion of the cruise. This would allow them to get some rest so that they would be fresh for the arrival into London. Like First Officer Morley, Matheson was new to the A340, with just under 300 hours on the aircraft. However, he had over 4,500 total hours of flying time. As the 13 cabin crew members helped the passengers settle into their seats, the baggage was loaded and the pilots completed the last of their pre-departure checks. The aircraft was loaded with 73 metric tons of fuel for the long journey east. As soon as the final checks were complete, the cabin crew closed the doors and Flight 24 was ready to go. Just before 9 o'clock that night, slightly behind schedule, the aircraft was pushed back from the gate at Los Angeles. The pilots started the plane's 4 engines and began taxiing out to runway 24 left. Their departure route would take them out over the Pacific Ocean initially, and then northeast towards the UK. The first officer was flying the aircraft on this night, while the captain handled the radios and did the paperwork. All appeared normal as the plane taxied out. After a short taxi, the first officer lined up on the runway and set takeoff thrust. Within moments, the plane was airborne, and the captain raised the landing gear. But unbeknownst to him, this routine action of raising the landing gear had set in motion a chain of events which would change the course of Flight 24 dramatically. As the left main gear retracted into its bay, a torque pin came loose. This pin then tumbled all the way down, landing on the shoreline just outside the airport perimeter. In the cockpit, the pilots had no way of knowing that this had just happened. All they noticed was that the landing gear took a bit longer than usual to retract. They had no idea that not all of their A340 would be accompanying them to London. Blissfully unaware, the first officer engaged the autopilot and the aircraft began turning northeast. The pilots and passengers alike were treated to an incredible view of the sprawling lights of Los Angeles as their plane climbed out over the Pacific Ocean. The A340 is a highly advanced aircraft with sensors located all around it, sending a constant stream of data to the plane's computers. Not too dissimilar to how you send out mountains of data whenever you do anything online, and that's where this video's sponsor, Incogni, comes in. Unlike the case for aircraft though, you probably don't want your data to be scooped up wherever you go. When it is, data brokers sell it to businesses and marketing agencies, leading to spam calls, emails, and even identity theft. If you're like me, you've already experienced the negative effects of having your data stolen. I get countless spam and phishing emails every week. This is one of the problems that I've been able to solve with Incogni, which reaches out to data brokers on my behalf and gets my personal data removed from the internet. And importantly, they don't just get it removed once and leave it at that. They make sure that it is taken down whenever it pops up again. This doesn't just go for email addresses though. Any information you share online can get stolen and sold. Your home address, your credit card information, your phone number, even your political beliefs and your employment history. If you live in the US, you may even be up on a people search site where anyone, including landlords, employers, and random strangers, can look you up and access your personal information. You could track down all of the places your data appears online yourself and get it removed, but this would take hundreds of hours to do. Incogni makes this mammoth task simple by doing it all for you, which means less spam calls, lower exposure to cyber attacks, and reduced financial risks. Sign up to Incogni today using my link in the video description or in the pinned comment on this video. You can get an individual plan for yourself, or you can protect your whole family with a family and friends plan, which covers up to 4 people. Make sure to use my code GREENDOT to get 60% off your purchase. What's more, Incogni are confident enough that you'll like their service that if you change your mind within the first 30 days, you'll get a full refund. So click on that link in the video description and pinned comment and use my code GREENDOT. But for now, back to the video. Before long, Flight 24 had reached its initial cruising altitude. With 13 cabin crew members attending to just 98 passengers, the meal service went by quickly. Once it was finished, many of the passengers tried to get some sleep. When they landed in Heathrow, it would be bright in the afternoon of the next day. But just as the passengers settled in, up in the cockpit, an unusual indication had caught the pilot's attention. While carrying out a routine review of the aircraft systems, the pilots had discovered something odd. The brake temperature sensor for the inner rear wheel of the left main gear displayed 2 crosses, meaning no signal. The A340 is a highly sophisticated aircraft with banks of computers monitoring inputs from hundreds of sensors around the plane. One faulty sensor, especially a single brake temperature sensor, wasn't too much cause for concern. But the pilots didn't know that this time, this odd reading had a much more serious cause, one which wouldn't make itself fully known to them until they were just moments from landing. For the next few hours, the plane cruised peacefully eastwards, all while the Terminator line, the line separating night from day, moved westwards towards it. By the time the plane had reached the Atlantic Ocean, the first glimmerings of sunrise were appearing on the horizon. It was a stunning sight for any passengers still awake, and for the pilots, it was the calm before a storm they would soon unwittingly enter. Almost 10 hours after leaving Los Angeles, Flight 24 had begun its descent towards London's Heathrow Airport. First Officer Morley was back at the controls after his rest, with Captain Barmby to his left and Relief Pilot Matheson behind them. The weather that afternoon was good, with winds from the south, some clouds, and great visibility. Air traffic control had told the crew to expect runway 27 left for landing. In just a few minutes, the flight would be making its final approach. Just after 3 p.m, the first officer lined up with runway 27 right at Heathrow. The flaps were set, the speed brakes were in the orange position, and the airspeed was coming back nicely. The final step now was to lower the gear. But just 8 miles from the runway, when the captain lowered the landing gear lever, something strange happened. The right main landing gear and the nose gear extended and locked into place as normal, but the left main gear appeared not to have moved. The plane's computer sent out a gear unsafe warning, and more related warnings appeared on the ECAM, the pilot's central display. There was no way the pilots could land in this condition. If they did, the aircraft could go careening off the side of the runway, possibly breaking apart, or even worse, crashing into the passenger terminal buildings. However, sometimes it takes a bit longer than normal for the gear to extend. There was a chance that the problem would right itself before they reached the ground. So they continued the approach, keeping a close eye on the gear indications. But as they got closer to the runway, it became clear that the gear was not going to extend. As they descended through 1,400 feet, the first officer raised the landing gear, and shortly after, put the plane into a climb. The captain informed the tower controller that the flight was carrying out a missed approach. Initially, the pilots figured that the gear may have just been slow to extend. Now that they were carrying out a missed approach, they would have more than enough time to get it down. But as soon as they raised the gear, they got another unwelcome message. the left landing gear hadn't locked up into place. In other words, it was neither up nor down. It appeared to be stuck somewhere in the middle, not the best place for landing gear. The captain informed air traffic control of the situation, and the pilots were given radar vectors to the Bovingdon radio beacon. They began climbing to 8,000 feet. At Bovingdon, they would enter a holding pattern, giving them time to troubleshoot the issue. The first thing the pilots tried was the gravity gear extension procedure. They slowed to between 190 and 200 knots, lowered the landing gear lever, and then used the gravity gear extension handle. This releases all of the hydraulic pressure, letting the gear extend and lock into place by gravity alone. If there was a hydraulic problem with the left main gear, this should get around it. They waited and watched the indications closely. But to their surprise, this had no effect. The other gear had lowered as normal, but the left gear still appeared to be stuck. Whatever the problem was, it couldn't be solved by their normal procedures. Luckily for the crew, they had encountered this issue just a few miles from the Virgin Atlantic Operations Department at Heathrow Airport. This meant that, as they held at Bovingdon to the north of the airport, they were well within radio range of the people who were perhaps best able to give them expert advice. The captain contacted operations over the radio and informed them of the flight's predicament. On the other end of the line were maintenance engineers and the chief pilot and A340 fleet manager. If they couldn't help the captain, he would be pretty much out of luck. The engineers suggested pulling and resetting some circuit breakers associated with the landing gear in case there was an electrical issue. The pilots tried this and then tried lowering the gear again. They watched their instruments, eagerly awaiting the extension of the left main gear. But again, it did nothing. Then, the engineers suggested the old classic technique of raising the gear handle lever and then lowering it again, and then lowering the gear by gravity extension. But no matter what the pilots did, they couldn't seem to get the gear to extend. Flight 24 continued holding above London. After much troubleshooting, it began to dawn on the crew that they may have no other choice but to land their massive aircraft without one of the landing gear legs. To say this posed a challenge was an understatement. This was something the pilots had never practiced in the simulator, and now they might have to do it for the first time in the real aircraft with over 100 people on board. But the passengers and crew were not the only ones who'd be affected by a crash landing at Heathrow. As soon as the airport's operations duty manager found out about the stricken plane, he contacted the airline and told them that if their flight crash landed at Heathrow, the airport would be left with only one main runway, causing major congestion. As a result, he suggested that the pilots diverted to Manston Airport in Kent, southeast England. This was a reasonable suggestion. Manston was a military base with a 9,000-foot long runway, well suited for a large aircraft like the A340. The airport had fire rescue services, and they'd be ready for Flight 24's arrival if the captain did decide to divert there. But unfortunately, time was not on the captain's side. As the 4-engine plane flew around the hold at 8,000 feet, it was burning fuel quickly. If the captain was going to divert, he would need to make this decision soon. The plane had only 1 hour of fuel remaining. But before doing anything as potentially catastrophic as landing without one of the main gear, the captain wanted to be absolutely certain that it even had a problem to begin with. After all, it was possible that there was nothing wrong with the gear at all, and that faulty sensors were the cause of all the indications. From their position in the cockpit, the pilots had no way of knowing for sure what the issue was. What they needed was for somebody on the ground to tell them. So, the captain asked air traffic control if he could do something that very few pilots will ever get to attempt at a busy airport like London Heathrow. He asked for a low-level approach to runway 27 right, followed by a flyby of the control tower right over the centre of the airport. This way, controllers could verify the status of the landing gear. This manoeuvre was approved by air traffic control. The captain informed the passengers and flight attendants of his plan. When they saw the terminals of Heathrow Airport going by right outside their windows, they were not to be concerned. Within a few minutes, the captain had lined up with the runway. He was now acting as pilot flying, with the first officer acting as pilot monitoring, and the relief pilot helping out with procedures and checklists. It was a busy few minutes as the aircraft neared the runway. an engineer from the airline had raced to the tower so that he would be ready to check the landing gear when the plane passed overhead. With the aircraft barely 300 feet above the ground, only slightly more than the wingspan of the A340, the captain banked to the left and headed directly towards the control tower at Heathrow. As he neared the centre of the airport, he banked to the right, giving those in the tower a clear view of the left main gear and belly of the A340. The engineer standing in the control tower determined that the left gear was partially extended, and he described it to the crew of Flight 24 as hanging in the bay. This was not good news, but the pilots weren't expecting much better. Now with the true state of the gear known, the captain began climbing and turning back northeast. Eager to get the gear fully down for a safe landing, the crew wanted to spend a few more minutes troubleshooting before attempting another approach. And this time, given that they had already exhausted their checklists, the airline's A340 fleet manager suggested over the radio that they try something a little unorthodox. He proposed that the pilots come back around for another approach, but rather than trying to land, they should touch down on the right main gear in an effort to bump the left landing gear down. The idea here was that this may shake free whatever was preventing the left gear from extending. This was a risky maneuver. In order for it to have any chance of working, the pilots would need to come down quite hard. But at the same time, they couldn't come down so hard that they would break the only good landing gear they had left. On top of this, there was also the chance that upon touching down on the right-hand side, the plane would just tilt over to the left and come crashing down, skidding off the runway. The pilots were tempted. Landing without the left main gear was fraught with danger. If they had any chance of lowering it, they would take it. As they discussed this possibility with each other, the low fuel warning came on in the cockpit. On top of all the other pressures they were facing, they now had the issue of time to contend with. They had to make the right decision, and they had to make it fast. On top of the other dangers inherent to the attempt to bump the landing gear free on the runway, even if it did work, the pilots would still have to come back around and land again once they had freed the gear. The extra fuel required for this was a luxury the pilots simply didn't have at this point. And after already being on duty for 12 hours through the night, the pilots themselves were now low on mental fuel too. With all of this in mind, the captain decided that the next approach they would do would be their final one. And to keep things familiar, he decided that he would be landing at London Heathrow, not Manston. The emergency vehicles at Heathrow got ready as Flight 24 began preparations for its final approach. Still trying to think of any last-minute solutions to the gear problem, maintenance personnel at Virgin Atlantic came up with another idea. Rather than using G-forces on the ground to free the gear, what if the pilots used them in the air? They asked the captain to try what would be a rather uncomfortable and frightening maneuver for the passengers: to put the plane in a steep turn and keep pulling back on the side stick in order to induce enough G-forces to pull the landing gear down. This was like a gravity gear extension, but with more gravity. Again, it wasn't in the procedures, but it made sense, and the captain figured that it was worth a shot. He put the plane in a steep turn with as much as 50 degrees angle of bank, so steep that it was closer to being on its side than straight and level. With the high workload the pilots were under at this point, they hadn't warned the passengers that they were going to do this beforehand. As they felt the plane turn sharply and got pushed into their seats by the powerful G-forces, many of the passengers became nervous. During the turn, they weighed 1.5 times their normal weight. As the captain banked low over London, the pilots watched their instruments carefully. This really was a last-ditch effort to get the gear down. The seconds ticked on, but as they did, the indications didn't change. Even weighing 1.5 times their normal weight wasn't enough to pull the gear down. There was no denying it now. This would be an emergency landing. Coming up to 10 minutes past 4 that afternoon, the crew declared a mayday to air traffic control. All departing aircraft were stopped, arriving aircraft were put into holding patterns, and the runways and taxiways were cleared of aircraft and vehicles. The airport fire trucks now began racing towards the runway and were given permission to enter it once the A340 had touched down. Everybody on the ground was preparing for the worst. Now, more low fuel warnings began appearing in the cockpit. The pilots really did have to land as soon as possible. But still, there was another consideration to make. There was a 13-knot crosswind from the south. Because the plane's vertical stabilizer acts like a weather vane, the aircraft tends to point into the wind. If the pilots landed on runway 27 right and lost control, there was a chance they would go off the runway to the left and crash into the passenger terminal buildings at Heathrow. The safer option, therefore, was to land on runway 27 left. That way, if they went off the side of the runway, they were less likely to crash into occupied buildings. With that in mind, the pilots began setting up to land on runway 27 left at Heathrow. To further increase their chances of staying on the runway, the fleet manager suggested to the pilots that they land on the right-hand side of the runway. This way, when the aircraft swung to the left after touchdown, it would have much more runway to eat into before going off the side. This assistance from people on the ground was crucial, as even the augmented crew of 3 in the cockpit was struggling to keep up with the intense workload as they configured the plane for landing. It was an extremely busy environment, with constant communication within the cockpit and between the cockpit and air traffic control, the airline, and the cabin crew. The pilots were functioning well together as a team, with the captain flying the aircraft, the first officer assisting with communications with air traffic control and the company, while the relief pilot helped find information in manuals and kept the cabin crew informed of the situation. To give them more time to run their checklists, the captain asked air traffic control for a 360-degree turn, which was granted. The pilots retracted the landing gear once more and went through the checklist from the top to ensure that nothing had been overlooked. They also told the cabin crew to prepare for an emergency landing and possible evacuation. These were the final crucial few minutes when the pilots still had the aircraft under control. They would need to do everything they could to maximize their chances of a successful outcome now. When they got on the ground, there would be very little they could do. At this point, nearing the approach path for the runway, the pilots reviewed the checklist for landing with abnormal gear. And here, they would meet one of the more important considerations they would have to make. As it turned out, the pilots didn't agree with the instructions given in the checklist. It told them to shut down all of the engines just before touchdown. The reason for this was clear. The engines would pose a serious fire risk once they began scraping along the ground. But the pilots knew that there was more to think about than just the risk of fire. The engines supply hydraulic power to the flight controls. If the pilots shut them down when they landed, they would have very little control over the aircraft. They would essentially become passengers in their own airplane as it scraped and skidded along the runway. To make this crash landing as survivable as possible, they would need to be able to control the aircraft for as long as they could, even if that increased the risk of fire. After discussing various possibilities with his colleagues, the captain devised a plan. They would touch down on the right main gear on the right-hand side of the runway. As soon as they touched down, the relief pilot would turn off engines 1 and 4, the 2 outboard engines on the end of the wings. These were the engines that would hit the ground first, and shutting them both down would reduce the chances of the plane swinging significantly after landing. By keeping engines 2 and 3 running, the plane would retain hydraulic power, which would allow the captain to control it using his side stick. He would use this control to hold the left wing in the air for as long as possible, keeping the engines off the runway. Then, when the aircraft had slowed down to the point that the wing could no longer stay in the air, the pilots would shut down the remaining engine on the left-hand side, followed shortly after by the inboard engine on the right-hand side. This careful, progressive shutdown of the aircraft's power plants was aimed at balancing the risk of fire with the need to maintain control of the plane for as long as possible on the ground. This was the plan anyway. Whether it actually worked as they zoomed along the runway at over 130 knots or 240 kilometers an hour was another question entirely. The fact was that the crew had now become test pilots and their passengers unwitting guinea pigs. Finally, the captain turned to line up for runway 27 left. In a few moments, he would see if his bet on the landing technique would pay off. Descending through 1,000 feet, the pilots warned the flight attendants and passengers that landing was imminent. Tension was high. There was nothing the crew could do now but action their plan. hope for the best. Just 200 feet above the ground, the pilots gave the order to brace. The flight attendants repeatedly shouted to the passengers to adopt the brace position as the aircraft neared the runway. This was the moment of truth. The captain kept the plane heading for the right-hand side of the runway. Sitting behind him with an overview of the cockpit, the relief pilot readied himself to shut down engines 1 and 4 on touchdown. Finally, the right main gear touched the ground. The relief pilot cut engines 1 and 4 immediately. The captain held the left wing up, but he went a bit too far, and the outboard engine on the right-hand side scraped along the runway, sending sparks flying. The passengers held on tight as the aircraft swung and shuddered violently. Fire crews began racing towards the plane, chasing it as it half flew, half drove down the runway. As the plane slowed down, it became harder and harder for the captain to hold the left wing in the air. He knew he would now need to bring it down. He slowly released pressure on the side stick and ordered for the inboard engine on the left-hand side to be shut down, which the relief pilot did. The left engines touched the ground, producing a trail of sparks and smoke along the runway. The captain began braking and then ordered the shutdown of the number 3 engine. The aircraft skidded to the left, and the captain pushed his right rudder fully to the stop, trying desperately to keep it from veering off the runway. This skidding put major stress on the right main wheels, causing the tires to burst. Finally, after a harrowing ordeal, the aircraft came to a halt on the runway. Incredibly, everybody on board was safe, with nobody sustaining even minor injuries during the landing. Within 3 minutes of touching down, all of the 114 passengers and crew had evacuated. Captain Barnaby's technique for landing the aircraft and shutting down the engines had proven so successful that Airbus adopted it as their official procedure after the incident. As for the cause of the gear trouble in the first place, investigators were not able to determine the exact failure sequence, as the gear assembly was missing crucial parts. However, it was clear that the pin which came loose and was found on the shore of the Pacific Ocean back at Los Angeles had been subject to higher loads than anticipated by Airbus during its life, and therefore that the assembly which it was part of would need to be redesigned. Nothing the pilots could have done during the flight would have been able to free the gear. Airbus have since redesigned this part, making jammed landing gear much less likely in future. On top of this, the changes they made to the checklists and to the quick reference handbook have meant that crews are now better equipped to deal with these problems when they do occur. This was an incident which could have ended up much worse were it not for the calm, methodical approach demonstrated by the flight crew, the help they got from those on the ground, and the willingness of everybody on board to think outside the box to accomplish a safe landing.